"Sir, if you don't stop complaining, we'll have to ask you to leave." That was the last thing he heard before the pain in his chest nearly took him down. But Thomas Whitaker didn't argue. He didn't plead. He just sat back down, eyes steady, breath shallow, and waited in silence, like a man used to being forgotten. The hospital was silent. Then the sound came. Windows shook. Dust rose. People pressed to the glass. A military helicopter cut across the sky, then dropped fast. Doors burst open. A woman in full uniform stepped through. Metal shining, eyes locked ahead. Her voice didn't rise. It cut clean. "We're here for Staff Sergeant Thomas Whitaker." And in that moment, the room forgot how to breathe. Tom Whitaker was born in the quiet town of Marion, Indiana, in the winter of 1951. His childhood was the kind most small-town boys knew. Barefoot summers, rusted bikes, and Sunday suppers where silence at the table was expected and respected. His father worked the railroad. His mother stitched uniforms for the local factory. Life was modest but grounded in hard values, loyalty, humility, and service. At 18, Tom enlisted in the Army. It wasn't a decision born out of glory or ambition. It was duty. His uncle had served in Korea. His grandfather in World War II. For Tom, stepping into uniform felt less like a choice and more like following footsteps already carved into the soil. What began as a simple act of enlistment grew into a career that would span decades. He deployed 3 times to Vietnam. Each tour harder than the last. By his third, Tom had risen to the rank of staff sergeant. Known among his men not for being loud, but for being unshakably calm. He wasn't the kind of leader who barked orders. He was the kind who checked your gear before you did and walked the perimeter twice before sleeping. His defining moment came during an ambush in the Lele Ocean jungle. The patrol had been pinned down by heavy fire. Trapped near a rice paddy with no cover and no radio contact. When his commanding officer was shot, Tom didn't wait. With bullets stitching the mud at his feet, he crawled out, hoisted 2 wounded soldiers, one over each shoulder, and made it nearly half a mile back through the jungle to a medevac site. His knuckles were raw, his shirt soaked in 3 people's blood. But he didn't stop. He wouldn't. That night, 5 men survived because of him. He received 2 Bronze Stars and a Purple Heart for his service, though he rarely spoke of them. Tom wasn't interested in ceremony. For him, what mattered was simple. The men came home. After retiring from active duty, Tom returned to Marion and married Helen, his high school sweetheart, the girl who had written him every week without fail during his deployments. They bought a small house on the edge of town. Nothing grand, but it had a porch swing and room for Helen's garden. That was enough. In civilian life, Tom became known as the neighbor who fixed everything. Broken stairs, he was there. A sputtering lawnmower, he'd have it running in 20 minutes. He charged nothing, refused tips. "Pay it forward," he'd say, wiping grease from his fingers with a half smile. And every Thursday, without fail, he volunteered at the local VA hospital, guiding younger vets through the maze of paperwork, listening to their stories when no one else would. Tom never called himself a hero. He was just a man who showed up when it counted. And somehow, even after war and loss, he remained kind, steady, reliable, a quiet constant in a town that slowly forgot just how much he had given. The morning started like any other in Marion. The sun had just crested the edge of the cornfields, and dew still clung to the grass as Tom Whitaker made his usual walk down Maple Avenue, toolbox in hand. He wasn't headed to any job site. Tom hadn't worked for pay in years. Today, like most mornings, he was on his way to check in on a neighbor. Mrs. Alvarez, a widowed school teacher who had lived 2 doors down for as long as anyone could remember, had mentioned a loose board on her front porch. "I'll take a look," Tom had said the day before, like he always did. No fuss, no schedule, just quiet dependability. By 9 a.m., he was kneeling on her steps, prying up the warped board and replacing it with one he had measured and cut in his garage earlier that week. Mrs. Alvarez brought him lemonade, which he refused twice before finally taking with a soft, "Thank you, ma'am." She smiled and sat nearby, chatting about her grandkids and the weather. Tom barely said a word, just listened, nodding occasionally while working with slow, practiced precision. Then it hit. A sharp pressure bloomed in the center of his chest. So sudden it took his breath. He paused, leaned forward, and gripped the edge of the railing, his jaw clenched. It wasn't the first time he'd felt tightness in his chest. But this was different. A tingling crept down his left arm and a cold sweat broke across his brow. "You okay, Tom?" Mrs. Alvarez asked, concern rising in her voice. He forced a nod, brushing it off with a hand wave. "Just stood up too quick," he murmured, though he hadn't moved. "I'm fine." But he wasn't. He knew it. He just didn't want to worry her. 10 minutes later, the pain hadn't faded. It had deepened, growing heavier, like someone pressing a cinder block to his chest. His hands trembled as he tried to collect his tools. Mrs. Alvarez had seen enough. "That's it," she said firmly, grabbing her keys. "You're getting in my car right now." Tom tried to protest, but when he took a step toward the driveway, he staggered. That was all it took. Mrs. Alvarez was already opening the passenger door. He hated being a burden, hated hospitals even more. But as he lowered himself into the seat, clutching his chest, something in him shifted. A quiet voice, the one trained long ago in jungles and field hospitals, whispered that this wasn't something he could walk off. They pulled out of the driveway toward St. Augustine Regional Hospital, the radio silent, the morning sun glaring across the windshield. Tom stared out the window and didn't say a word. He had a sinking feeling that something important had just changed, but he had no idea just how much. The sliding glass doors of St. Augustine Regional Hospital wheezed open, letting in a blast of summer heat and the quiet sound of an old man's labored breathing. Tom Whitaker stepped through, guided gently by Mrs. Alvarez, and blinked at the harsh fluorescent lights above. The waiting room was already half full, crying children, anxious mothers, a teenager with a sprained wrist texting with one hand, and a man in a suit pacing as he held his phone to his ear. The walls were beige, the floors a dull linoleum, and the air smelled of antiseptic and reheated cafeteria food. A television mounted in the corner droned out daytime news, ignored by everyone. It could have been any hospital lobby in America. But to Tom, it felt a little colder than usual. He walked slowly to the reception desk, shoulders back, standing as straight as his aging spine would allow. 40 years of military service hadn't left him untouched. His knees ached in the rain, and his hearing wasn't what it used to be, but his posture remained like iron, a habit too deeply forged to forget. The young woman behind the desk didn't look up when he stepped forward. "Name?" she asked flatly, fingers clacking away on her keyboard. "Thomas Whitaker," he said gently, the rasp in his voice unmistakable. "Chest pain? Left side?" "It's been building since this morning." She finally glanced up, brow arched with disinterest. "Insurance card." Tom reached into his wallet and pulled out his VA identification. "I'm a veteran," he added. "Retired Army, 40 years in service." The receptionist stared at the card for half a second, then handed it back. "That's not insurance, sir. You'll have to wait your turn. We're short-staffed." He opened his mouth, then closed it. "I just thought we don't prioritize based on someone's story," she cut in. "Everyone waits. You'll be called when it's your turn." Her eyes were already back on the screen. Tom took a breath. He wanted to say something, anything. But instead, he nodded and turned to find a seat. His chest ached worse now, but the sting wasn't just physical. He sat stiffly on one of the hard plastic chairs lining the wall and placed his wallet back into his coat pocket. Inside was a folded photograph of Helen. She would have told him to speak up, to demand attention, but he'd never been good at making scenes. From his seat, he watched as a man in a tailored suit walked briskly to the front, exchanged a few hushed words with the same receptionist, then slipped a small folded bill across the counter. Within minutes, his name was called. A boy with a bandaged finger was next. Then a young woman with a sore throat. Each time a new name rang out over the intercom, Tom felt a little more invisible. He coughed, leaned forward slightly, and pressed his hand harder to his chest. Sweat was beginning to pool under his collar. He looked around. Not one person met his eyes. This was not the battlefield where your rank mattered and your actions counted. This was not the VA office where he volunteered and was greeted with handshakes and stories. Here, in this room of indifference and fluorescent light, Tom Whitaker was just another old man with a problem no one wanted to solve. He stared at the tiled floor beneath his feet and thought, not for the first time, so this is how it ends. Not in a firefight, not with honor, but in line with a number waiting to be called. Tom leaned forward in the stiff plastic chair, trying to slow his breathing, his palm pressed firmly to the center of his chest as if sheer will could hold his heart in place. Around him, the waiting room buzzed with distant voices, a crying child, the beeping of a monitor behind a cracked door. But for Tom, the present had started to dissolve. His mind drifted uninvited to a jungle half a world away. The humidity had been suffocating, the kind that clung to your skin and seeped into your lungs. He was 27 then, boots caked in red clay, rifle slung across his chest. They'd been ambushed outside a village in Laos. His squad cut off, outnumbered, and pinned down. Lieutenant Farrow had taken a round to the thigh, screaming, bleeding out fast. There had been no time to wait for orders. Tom remembered the way the bullets zipped overhead like angry hornets, the way smoke curled through the trees, and the metallic tang of blood thick in the air. He remembered slinging Farrow over his shoulder, one arm under the lieutenant's back, the other gripping his rifle, and running. Not crawling, not ducking, running. Every step was a prayer. Every breath borrowed time. He could still hear the whine of the Huey as it lifted off just seconds after he dragged Farrow aboard. The medics had yelled. The crew chief had pulled him in by the vest. Then everything had gone dark. Back in the waiting room, Tom flinched as a burst of laughter echoed from a group of teenagers across the room. The pain in his chest twisted sharper, like barbed wire wrapped around his ribs. His eyes dropped to the floor, but in his mind he saw a garden, peas and white hydrangeas. Helen kneeling in the dirt with her sun hat, calling over her shoulder, "You're not done until you sweep the porch, soldier." Her voice had always been warm but firm. It was the same voice that had steadied him when he got back from Vietnam and couldn't sleep through the night. The same voice that told him he wasn't broken, that he was still a whole man even with the scars. And now in the sterile quiet of St. Augustine's waiting room, he heard it again, soft and sure. "Stay with me, Tom. You're not done yet." He blinked, swallowed, and straightened his back. But beneath that stubborn discipline, something hollow ached. Not fear of death. He'd made peace with that in his 20s. It was the fear of fading away, of being reduced to just the guy on the bench. A man who had carried wounded soldiers through enemy fire, who had spent a lifetime showing up when it counted, now dismissed as background noise in a room too busy to look twice. He wasn't afraid of the end. He was afraid of it meaning nothing. He shifted in his seat and looked around. No one noticed him. No one remembered his name. But still, he stayed upright because Helen would have expected nothing less. From his post near the sliding entrance, Cal Roberts leaned against the wall and sipped lukewarm coffee from a stained paper cup. His job as hospital security was usually routine: diffuse family arguments, check for loiterers, walk the late-night rounds. But years in the Navy had taught him something that no manual or HR briefing ever could. How to read a room, how to spot the quiet ones, the ones fading into the background, not because they were harmless, but because they were hurting. And the old man in the olive jacket, he wasn't just another waiting patient. Cal had noticed him the second he came in. The posture, military, the discipline, obvious, but it was more than that. It was the way the man tried to hide the tremble in his fingers as he clutched his chest. The way he blinked through the pain, refusing to show weakness. Cal didn't know his name yet, but he'd seen that kind of quiet suffering before, in the VA, in rehab wards, in the mirror. Tom Whitaker wasn't fidgeting. He wasn't complaining. He was enduring. And Cal had learned a long time ago, when a man like that starts going quiet, it means the pain is getting louder. Across the room, Angela Fields, a pediatric nurse on break, walked through the waiting area with a granola bar in hand and a pair of headphones tucked under her collar. She didn't usually stop, but something about the old man caught her eye. His face was too pale. His lips had a bluish tinge. The shallow breathing was unmistakable. She walked straight to the reception desk. "That man needs to be seen immediately," she said, voice low but firm. The receptionist, barely looking up, muttered, "His chart says he's stable." "He's waiting like everyone else." Angela leaned in slightly. "He's not stable. That's textbook cardiac distress. I'm a nurse." "I don't care if you're the Surgeon General," the receptionist snapped, her voice now clipped and sharp. "You don't dictate triage. You're not in emergency." Angela's jaw tensed. She looked over at Cal, who returned her glance with a slow, knowing nod. Something wasn't right, but protocols were ironclad, and this desk clerk was clinging to her clipboard like it was a weapon. Back in the corner of the room, Tom noticed a little girl, no older than 5, sitting beside her mother 2 chairs away. Her legs swung nervously, and her eyes welled with tears as she looked at the bandage on her hand. Tom shifted, fighting through the pain, and reached into his coat pocket. From it he pulled out a small wooden horse, worn smooth from age, something he used to carve while Helen worked in the garden. "Hey there," he whispered hoarsely, holding the toy out gently. The girl hesitated, then took it with both hands. She smiled through her sniffles. Her mother looked up. "Thank you," she said softly. Tom just nodded. Cal watched it all from a distance. An old man nearly collapsing, still thinking of others before himself. He set down his coffee. Enough was enough. He turned and walked down the hallway toward the employee phone in the back office, one line that bypassed the main desk and went straight to the VA's rapid contact network, because something in his gut told him this wasn't just any patient. This was someone whose name meant something, and someone somewhere needed to be reminded of that. Cal Roberts stepped away from the front desk, his gut twisted tighter with every glance at the man in the olive jacket. Tom Whitaker wasn't just uncomfortable. He was deteriorating, chest rising shallow, fingers twitching like he was holding off a collapse with sheer discipline, and no one was doing a damn thing. Cal knew the rules. He also knew when the rules failed. He slipped into the staff corridor near the break room where cell reception was spotty but good enough. He scrolled past names he hadn't dialed in years until he found it. VA Martin Keller. Martin had been his commanding officer once, now a senior coordinator in the Veterans Affairs Outreach Unit. If anyone knew how to move mountains without paperwork, it was Keller. The phone rang twice. "Keller. Cal Roberts. I've got a situation. St. Augustine Regional Civilian ER. Old timer. Name's Thomas Whitaker, retired staff sergeant. Chest pains. He's being ignored." There was a pause, then a shift in tone. "Wait, did you say Thomas Whitaker? Vietnam, 3 tours, Silver Star?" "Yeah, that's the one. I've heard stories about that guy." Cal's voice dropped. "He's going down fast. No one's listening. I need you to make some noise." Keller didn't ask questions. "Stay close. Don't interfere. I'll handle it." The call ended, but the ripples had already begun. Within 5 minutes, an urgent alert pinged inside the Department of Veterans Affairs. The name Thomas Whitaker triggered not just a personnel file, but a history, citations, rescue missions, decades of mentorship at VA clinics. A name whispered respectfully across 3 generations of service members. Keller made 2 more calls. One to a Colonel Diane Mercer, currently stationed nearby on special assignment. The second to a liaison at the Office of Military Medical Coordination. No alarms, no sirens, no headlines, just a quiet chain of respect activating behind the scenes. Because sometimes real power doesn't announce itself. Back in the waiting room, Cal re-emerged and stood by the doors, arms crossed, watching over Tom Whitaker like a sentry. He didn't know how long it would take, but he knew help was coming. At first, it was just a sound, low, distant, and strange. A soft tremor in the air, barely noticed over the hum of hospital televisions and the occasional beep of a vital monitor. But then it grew louder, rhythmic, heavy, inevitable. Whump whump whump. Heads turned toward the windows. Conversations trailed off mid-sentence. A nurse leaned against the glass, squinting up at the sky. Outside, leaves whipped in circles, dust rising like smoke from the hospital's parking lot. People shielded their eyes from the sun as the silhouette emerged. A military helicopter, dark green, descending fast. Inside the waiting room, silence spread like a wave. Phones dropped, children hushed. The receptionist froze mid-keystroke, eyes flicking toward the entrance. The helicopter didn't hesitate. It cut a sharp arc through the sky, then dropped into the hospital lot with practiced precision. The rotors tore the air apart, sending debris flying and car alarms into chaos. Within seconds of touching down, the side doors flew open. 3 figures stepped out. Colonel Diane Mercer led them, her dress uniform immaculate, her ribbons catching the light like fire. Her stride was purposeful, boots hitting pavement with the finality of a gavel. Behind her, 2 military medics in combat fatigues carried a trauma kit between them. Expressions unreadable, movements rehearsed. They didn't pause. They didn't ask for permission. The glass doors of St. Augustine's flew open as they entered. Gusts of wind still stirring papers on the receptionist's desk. The colonel scanned the room once, then lifted her voice, not loud, but sharp enough to slice through the still air. "Where is Staff Sergeant Thomas Whitaker?" The room froze. Cal Roberts, now standing tall by the wall, stepped forward and nodded toward the old man slumped in the corner chair. The medics moved instantly. The receptionist's face drained of color. She stood, lips parting in stunned silence as Colonel Mercer approached Tom's chair and knelt beside him. "Sergeant Whitaker," she said gently. "I'm Colonel Diane Mercer. You don't know me, but you saved my father's life in 1972. Laos, Operation Iron Arrow. He told me about you every birthday, every Christmas. Every time I needed courage." Tom looked up slowly, eyes clouded by pain and disbelief. "We're here," she said, her voice cracking ever so slightly. "Because it's our turn to carry you." Behind her, the hospital's chief administrator appeared, summoned by the VA with little explanation other than, "This man matters. Make it right." He stood in stunned silence, watching as the medics began to assess Tom's vitals, their hands practiced and efficient, their demeanor reverent. The other patients watched in hushed awe, piecing together what was unfolding before them. The quiet old man they'd ignored for hours wasn't just someone's grandpa. He was a war hero, a man who had saved lives with his own hands and expected nothing in return. The receptionist sat back down slowly, avoiding eye contact with everyone. As the medics lifted Tom carefully onto a stretcher, Colonel Mercer remained by his side, holding his hand with the respect of a soldier greeting a general. For the first time that day, Tom didn't feel invisible. He felt seen, respected, carried. And as the stretcher moved through the corridor toward the trauma bay, whispers followed in its wake, not of gossip, but of reverence. Because when the rotors cut the sky and boots hit the floor, the hospital learned a lesson it would never forget. Some names carry history, and some lives deserve to be answered with honor. The trauma team was ready by the time the stretcher burst through the ER doors. Colonel Mercer didn't leave Tom's side, not for a second. The hospital's on-call cardiologist, now fully briefed on who was in his care, met them at the elevator with a team already gloved and scrubbed. The medical staff, once indifferent, now moved with precision and urgency. Within minutes, Thomas Whitaker was in surgery. The diagnosis, a massive myocardial infarction, a heart attack that had been building for hours. Had it gone just 10 more minutes, they said, he wouldn't have made it. The procedure was delicate, but successful. 2 stents were inserted, his vitals stabilized. And he would live, barely. When Tom woke up the next morning in the intensive care unit, he was surrounded not by machines, but by people. Colonel Mercer sat at his bedside, still in uniform, her posture formal, even in the quiet. The hospital administrator stood nearby, flanked by senior staff. A flag had been placed at the foot of his bed. Tom blinked slowly. "You all waiting for me to die?" Mercer laughed softly, wiping at her eyes. "Just making sure you know we see you." News of the incident spread fast. First through veteran networks, then to local media outlets. It wasn't just a feel-good story. It was a reckoning. The hospital board launched a full internal review within 48 hours. Cal Roberts, whose quiet intuition and decisive action saved Tom's life, was formally recognized at a city press conference. A commendation for distinguished civilian vigilance in defense of veteran honor was pinned to his chest by the mayor himself. Angela Fields, the pediatric nurse who tried to intervene, was promoted to assistant chief nurse for her department. In interviews, she didn't mention the receptionist by name, only said, "We have to be better at seeing the people who aren't demanding to be seen." As for the receptionist, she was let go without ceremony. No announcement, no farewell email. One morning she wasn't at the desk anymore, and no one asked why. The fallout reached even higher. St. Augustine Regional Hospital issued a revised emergency triage policy within a week, ensuring that veteran status would trigger an automatic medical flag in the intake system, particularly in cases where verbal complaints were being overlooked. Meanwhile, Tom's hospital room became a quiet pilgrimage site. Over the next few days, dozens of visitors arrived, fellow veterans, members of the American Legion, former trainees from Fort Hollister who had long since started families of their own. Some brought letters, others brought photos. One man, now a grandfather himself, brought a rusted dog tag that Tom had retrieved from a battlefield and mailed home after the war. Tom said little to most of them, just nodded, eyes tired, but soft. He never liked being the center of attention, but the gesture wasn't about him. It was about the ripple effect. His story had lit something in people. A few days after he stabilized, Colonel Mercer returned to his room alone. She brought a photograph, black and white, faded at the corners. It was of her father in uniform with a younger Tom beside him in the jungle, both smiling despite the grime. "He never forgot you," she said. "He told me the kind of man you were. That you didn't just save his life, you changed it." Tom stared at the photo for a long time, then handed it back. "Tell him I didn't do it for thanks. I did it because it was right." Colonel Mercer smiled. That's exactly what he said, too. In a world that often moves too fast to remember, Tom Whitaker was suddenly, undeniably remembered. And as he watched sunlight spill across his hospital floor, he understood something deeper than medals or headlines. The fight might be over, but the legacy wasn't. Tom Whitaker's recovery was slow, but steady. Each day brought a little more color to his cheeks, a little more strength to his grip. The doctors monitored him closely, but it was the visitors, not the medication, that truly brought him back to life. They came quietly, respectfully, sometimes with flowers, sometimes with nothing more than a firm handshake. Fellow veterans, many in ball caps adorned with unit patches or medals, sat by his bedside and swapped stories. Some had served with him. Others had only heard about the staff sergeant who never left a man behind. They came from nearby counties and even out of state, drawn not by duty, but by gratitude. Military families arrived, 2 sons and daughters of soldiers Tom had once pulled from the mud or trained before their first deployment. A woman brought a letter her father had written decades ago describing a quiet soldier named Whitaker who had saved an entire unit by holding a position alone for nearly 2 hours. Tom didn't remember the name, but the story was true. Every day at noon, Colonel Diane Mercer stopped by, never in uniform now, just slacks and a blouse, though her presence still carried the same weight. On the 4th day, she brought something different, a faded photograph. It showed her father, young and bloodied, sitting against a tree in a jungle clearing. Kneeling beside him, tending to his wounds, was a man in a muddy helmet. Tom Whitaker. "My father never let me forget you," she said softly. "Said you were the reason he got to come home and hold me as a baby. Every promotion he got, he raised a glass to you." Tom looked at the photo for a long moment before nodding, eyes misting over. "He was a good man," he said quietly. "Brave. I just happened to be there first." Later that evening, another visitor arrived. A man in his 40s, still in business slacks, travel wrinkled, tie loose. Eric Whitaker, Tom's son. He stood in the doorway, eyes wide with disbelief. "Dad," he whispered. "What? What is all this?" Tom chuckled lightly, the sound raspy but real. "Long story, son." As Eric pulled up a chair, he glanced at the cards, photos, and flags decorating the room. "I didn't know half of this," he said. "Why didn't you ever tell me?" Tom smiled gently. Didn't see the point. I wasn't trying to be remembered, just trying to do my part. Eric reached over and took his father's hand. Well, now the world remembers, Dad, and I won't forget either. The room fell quiet again, but this time it wasn't lonely. It was full. 3 weeks later, Tom Whitaker walked through the sliding glass doors of the Marion, Virginia clinic just as he had every Thursday for the past 6 years. Only now he moved a little slower. His steps were more careful, his breath measured. But he was there, and this time he wasn't alone. The waiting room that once echoed with quiet discomfort now buzzed with conversation. Veterans, young and old, turned as he entered, some offering nods, others standing to shake his hand. A few had heard the story. Most just felt the weight of the man behind it. The receptionist, a new one, smiled warmly and greeted him by name. Tom gave a small wave and took his usual seat near the back corner where he always listened more than he spoke, where he offered advice, not from books, but from scars and memory. Over the following weeks, word of what happened at St. Augustine Regional became more than a news clip. It became a reminder, not just of a moment, but of a truth often forgotten. That Real service doesn't demand attention. It simply shows up again and again until someone finally sees it. Tom never told the full story himself. He didn't need to. The people who mattered carried it forward in whispers, in nods, in the quiet ways veterans recognized their own. Sometimes he'd catch a young man watching him from across the room, someone uncertain, searching. Tom would meet his eyes and nod, silent, steady. Because some heroes never ask for thanks, but someone always remembers. In today's fast-paced world, it's easy to overlook quiet people. The ones who never boast, never ask for credit, and never push their way forward. But as Tom Whitaker's story reminds us, some of the greatest heroes are the ones sitting silently in the corner, carrying lifetimes of service and sacrifice without saying a word. This story isn't just about one man. It's about how we treat those who came before us, those who built the freedoms we live under today. It asks us, are we paying attention? Are we listening when someone like Tom quietly walks into the room? His journey teaches us that honor isn't found in medals or headlines, but in how we show up for one another when it matters most. It's a lesson every generation needs to hear. We invite you to reflect on this story. Have you ever met someone like Tom? Someone whose quiet life hid a powerful legacy? Share your thoughts in the comments below. How do you think our communities can better recognize and care for veterans? If this story moved you, please like, subscribe, and turn on notifications to help us continue sharing real stories that matter on Valor Stories. We share new videos each week that honor veterans, acts of kindness, and the everyday courage that still exists in our world. And remember, some heroes never ask to be seen, but it's up to us to make sure they never feel invisible. Thank you for watching.